I still remember the road that led me here. It was a dirt ribbon through swamp and cypress, winding toward a town that most maps no longer name. The locals call it Beaumont's Rest, though nobody seems to agree on who Beaumont was or why he ever rested here. I came chasing a rumor, one that had survived in whispers for more than a century. They said there was once a woman, a madam, who ran an orphanage for rescued girls. Her story was supposed to be an act of charity, a woman saving children from poverty and ruin. But every story I found about her ended the same way, abruptly, as if someone had torn the last pages from history. When I stepped out of the car, the air itself felt like old paper, dry, brittle, and heavy with dust. The church bell tower still stood, though the bell was long gone. The windows were boarded, and the sign outside had half rotted away. The St. Isabel Home for Girls. The locals watched me from porches and shop doors. They never asked who I was. They only said, "You're here for the madam, aren't you?" and then shut their doors as though afraid of their own voices. I found a room above the old post office, the kind of place where wallpaper curls off like dead skin. That night, I unpacked the files I'd gathered. Yellowed newspaper clippings, property deeds, one crumbling photograph showing a stern woman flanked by 10 small girls in white dresses. The back of the photo was stamped 1907. I couldn't sleep. Somewhere in the night, I heard the faint rhythm of a piano drifting through the walls, a tune repeating the same 3 notes, slow and uneven, as if someone were learning it for the first time. When I went downstairs to ask about it, the clerk only said, "That sound comes every year, around this time." The next morning, I walked to the church grounds. The gate hung half open, its hinges shrieking at the slightest push. Weeds had swallowed the path, but beneath them, the old stones of the walkway still formed a perfect line leading to the front door. It was locked, but the side annex, the part once used as a classroom, had a broken window large enough to climb through. Inside, the air smelled of chalk and iron. The floor was scattered with lesson slates, rusted nails, and a single book with the cover torn away. On its first page, written in a hand both elegant and cruel, was a single sentence. "Discipline is salvation." I pocketed the book. Then I saw the wall at the back of the room, the faint outline of a doorway, long since plastered over. The plaster cracked when I touched it, and a rush of air came through, cold and damp like breath from underground. By dusk, I'd found the caretaker, a man named Gideon, and asked if he knew anything about the room. His hand shook as he lit a cigarette. "There's nothing back there," he said. "You don't open walls in Beaumont's Rest." That's how the madam kept things tidy. He refused to say more. But as I turned to leave, he called after me. "You'll hear them before you see them. The girls. Don't answer if they ask your name." That night, I dreamt of the photograph again. This time the faces of the 10 girls had blurred into one. The madam's face remained clear, sharp, composed, a smile that never touched her eyes. When I woke, it was 3 a.m., and the piano tune had returned. The same 3 notes, now coming from the direction of the church. Against reason, I followed it. The moonlight cut through fog like the beam of a lantern underwater. At the gate, the music stopped. The doors of the chapel, once locked, now stood open. I stepped inside. The pews were gone. Only indentations in the dust marked where they had been. At the altar lay 10 small chairs arranged in a perfect semicircle, each draped in a child's dress, white gone yellow with time. A ledger sat on the pulpit, its pages open to names written in ink that had not faded. I read the first few lines. Isabel Beaumont, 1867 to 1919. Admissions, 143 girls. Departures, 143 girls. Unaccounted, 0. No orphanage in history has ever had a perfect record. Then, beneath the list, a final note in smaller handwriting. All daughters of grace shall find their purpose. The words chilled me, not for what they said, but for what they avoided saying. I closed the ledger, yet when I looked back, the names seemed to shimmer faintly, as though the ink were still wet. When I left the church, dawn was already cutting through the mist. The town felt awake in a new way, windows unshuttered, people standing silent at corners, watching. One woman whispered, "The anniversary's close. Best you leave before the 15th. I asked what happened on the 15th. She crossed herself and said only, "That's when the madam takes attendance." Morning came gray and thin. The mist had not lifted, only folded itself closer to the ground. I felt as if the town were breathing shallowly, waiting for something it had always known would return. I started the day at the town archives, a narrow brick building beside the old mill. The archivist, a quiet man with a crooked necktie, led me through shelves of county records that smelled of mildew and neglect. He didn't ask why I wanted files from 1900 to 1920. He only said, "Some ledgers you'll find empty." He was right. Most of the orphanage records had been blotted out, entire pages glued together, as though someone had poured starch between them. But one ledger was different, thin, brittle, half-burned at the edges. On its first intact page was a list of donations: bolts of cloth, bread, and books, and 5 traveling trunks delivered monthly by rail. Each trunk was marked with a single word: purpose. No further description. I copied the notes and asked about building plans. The archivist hesitated, then unlocked a drawer. "Only this survived the flood," he said. It was a blueprint of the church property, sanctuary, classrooms, and, drawn faintly beneath them, a tunnel leading to something called Lower Hall. The tunnel ended under the bell tower, where a small box symbol was labeled Archives B. That night, I returned to the church with a lantern. The air inside was colder now, as if the building remembered being underground. I followed the corridor behind the altar, found a loose section of floorboards, and pried it open. Beneath was a narrow staircase spiraling into dark. The smell of dust gave way to something mineral, like the inside of a cave. The steps ended at an iron door. I pressed my shoulder to it, and the hinges gave a long metallic sigh. Inside was a low brick chamber lined with wooden drawers. Every drawer was numbered. Some still carried nameplates: Abigail 3, Ruth 5, Clara 9. I opened one at random. Inside lay not bones or relics, but paper, hundreds of folded notes bound with ribbon, each marked with the same date. Letters, maybe, or confessions. I opened the first. It read, "We recite the verses each night before sleep. She says obedience makes us whole. I dream of the bell, but we are told the bell does not ring for us." The handwriting trembled, but the ink was fresh enough to blur beneath my fingers. Another note read, "Tomorrow we move below. She says the world above forgets. That is mercy." The ribbons were identical, red faded to brown. There must have been hundreds of these drawers, each with its own set of letters, each the same confession rewritten by different hands. Whoever the madam had been, she had turned confession into repetition, faith into handwriting practice. At the far end of the chamber stood a single trunk. I knew it before I reached it: purpose. The lid was locked, but the metal had corroded enough that it crumbled under my lantern's base. Inside were ledgers, carefully preserved. Each page paired a girl's name with a single phrase: reassigned. No destinations, no adoptive families, only that word. When I touched the paper, I felt the faintest vibration under my palm, like a hum too low for the ear. It could have been my pulse, or something else, something that had waited here for a century. Then I noticed the walls. Between the bricks were carvings, almost erased, small circles joined by lines, like constellations. In the center of each circle was a letter, sometimes an R, sometimes a G, sometimes a blank. The pattern seemed deliberate, a language half remembered. I lifted the lantern higher. Shadows twisted with the light, and for a heartbeat the carvings looked like faces turned toward me, mouths open not in scream, but in chant. The sound that filled the chamber was not echo but rhythm. I realized the low hum I felt earlier was a tone, vibrating through the stone. It rose and fell like breath. I should have left then, but curiosity is its own kind of possession. I traced one of the carvings with my fingertip. The stone was warm. A rush of air brushed past me, and the lantern dimmed. I smelled candle wax, fresh, though none burned nearby. Above, the church bell, silent for decades, gave a single hollow strike. The vibration stopped. The air turned still again. I climbed back to the surface, each step heavier than the one before. When I emerged, dawn was beginning to bruise the sky. I walked to the riverbank to clear my thoughts, but the reflection staring back from the water looked older than I remembered. My eyes seemed clouded, as if they had seen more nights than my years allowed. At breakfast, the post office clerk avoided my gaze. He slid a sealed envelope across the counter. "Found this in your mailbox," he said. No stamp. Inside was a photograph, identical to the one I already had, except that this version showed 11 children. I counted twice. The new face was mine. That night, I wrote in my journal that perhaps Beaumont's rest wasn't cursed at all. Maybe it was preserved, like a pressed flower, so that its mistakes could never fade. Every story needs a keeper. Perhaps the madam had simply chosen a new one. I tried to sleep, but the floorboards below my room pulsed faintly, the same rhythm I'd heard beneath the church. Somewhere, a bell marked the hour, not 12, not 1, but something between them, a time without a number. I whispered to myself that there was no such thing as ghosts, only memory made solid. But when the window rattled and a child's voice asked softly from the dark, "Are you ready for attendance?" I did not answer. I only listened and counted my breaths until dawn. I spent the morning pretending that nothing had changed. I bought coffee from the corner stall, nodded at the clerk, walked the same cracked sidewalk past the church. The town seemed ordinary again, too ordinary, as if Beaumont's rest were performing normalcy for my sake. But every window I passed reflected not my face, but the photograph from the envelope, 11 children, arranged neatly, myself among them. The reflection would flicker back to normal only when I blinked. By noon, the mist returned. It moved with purpose, coiling between the houses like smoke, remembering its source. I tried to call the county office to report the tunnel, the drawers, the letters. The line crackled, then died. When I stepped outside, the street was empty except for one figure waiting by the church gate. Gideon, the caretaker. He looked thinner than before, almost transparent in the light. He said, "The town wants you to speak tonight. The hall's been opened." I asked what hall. He only smiled and said, "The same one under your feet." At dusk, a bell rang. The same one that had been silent for years. The sound rolled across the river like thunder trapped in metal. People emerged from their houses, each carrying a candle. No one spoke. They moved in a single line toward the church, and somehow I moved with them. It felt rehearsed, like a ritual repeated too many times to question. Inside, the pews were back, perfectly aligned. The dresses on the chairs had vanished. At the altar stood a tall woman in gray. Her features were ordinary, but the longer I looked, the more wrong they became. Eyes too still, posture too exact, the kind of composure that doesn't bend even to breathing. She spoke without raising her voice. Every generation owes a record of itself. The townspeople murmured assent. My pulse hammered. She turned to me. "You have entered without invitation. Now you will testify." I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted. A heavy book rested on the altar, the same ledger from before, but now its pages were blank. She opened it and gestured for me to come forward. "Write what you have seen," she said. Her tone was neither threat nor request. It was duty, ancient and indifferent. My hands obeyed before my will could catch up. The pen was cold, the ink darker than black, like the residue of burned oil. I began to write. Every detail of the tunnels, the letters, the hum. Each word bled into the paper until the page shimmered with movement. When I finished, she closed the book. The candlelight flickered and every face in the pews blurred. I realized that none of the people were actually watching me. They were watching her, waiting for a cue. She said, "Attendance complete." The candles went out at once. Darkness pressed close, but in it I heard breathing. Hundreds of shallow breaths, not from the congregation, but from beneath the floorboards. The sound rose and fell, forming the same three-note rhythm as the piano. The air thickened, alive with memory. When light returned, the woman in gray was gone. Only the ledger remained, still warm where her hands had touched it. The townspeople filed out in silence, leaving me alone. I opened the book again. The ink of my confession had dried into neat rows of names. At the very end was a new line already waiting for me to fill. Custodian. I left the church before dawn. The air was heavy with that strange stillness that comes when even the insects refuse to stir. The town was silent again, as though the procession and the woman in gray had been only a shared dream. Yet on every doorstep lay a candle burned halfway down, wax hardened into the same 3 drips. Left, right, center. The rhythm again. I walked to the river. The water there never truly moved. It quivered, reflecting the sky like glass about to break. When I leaned close, I saw the faint outline of the church bell tower in the surface, except the reflection showed 2 towers instead of one. One stood straight, the other bent inward, swallowed by fog. That was when I noticed something carved into the stones by the waterline. rows of names, each ending with a date, none later than 1919. The last entry simply said Isabel B., and below it, in smaller letters, record complete. I traced the carving and found that the stone felt warm, as if sunlight touched it even though the sky remained clouded. The warmth pulsed once, faintly, like a heartbeat. Back at my rented room, I tried to leave, to pack my notes and drive out of Beaumont's Rest, but every road that should have led away was closed. Barriers of wood and wire stood across them, freshly nailed, no footprints, no tools. I walked for hours and always ended back where I began, the square facing the church. By evening, I accepted that departure was not a direction but a permission, and I hadn't been granted it. So I wrote. I copied every note, every carving, every whisper that memory could hold. The act of writing steadied my hands. Words became rails, and I moved along them until night fell. Then came the knocking. 3 slow taps against the window pane. When I looked, no one was there. Only the reflection of the ledger lying on the table, its cover slightly open. Inside, new writing had appeared, neat as a clerk's. The custodian must finish the record before the 15th. I counted the days. 2 remained. Sleep came in fragments. In one fragment, I stood again beneath the church, but the drawers were gone. In their place were mirrors, hundreds of them, each reflecting not me, but a single candle burning in endless space. A voice, hers, said, "Every flame remembers its keeper." When I woke, my room smelled faintly of soot. The wallpaper above my bed had blistered into the shape of circles joined by lines, the same constellation pattern carved in the tunnel. I spent the next day searching for any living record of Isabel Beaumont. The county courthouse, the newspaper archives, the church registry, all held the same blank between 1918 and 1920. It was as if 2 years had been erased, not lost but removed. Only one clue remained, a death certificate without a body, signed by the parish coroner. Cause of death, disappearance. The signature beneath it was Gideon's. I confronted him that evening at the gate. He didn't deny it. He only said, "She never died. She divided herself among us, so the ledger would never close." His eyes looked wet and old, reflecting candlelight that wasn't there. When the record is finished, the custodian becomes the bell. I wanted to ask what that meant, but he turned away and crossed himself with trembling fingers. "You're already hearing it," he whispered. That night the sound returned. Not the piano, not the hum, but the bell itself, ringing slow and hollow inside my skull. With every toll, I felt the town breathe through me, as though I had become its lung. On the 12th toll, the vibration settled into my bones and stayed there, waiting. I wrote until dawn, unable to stop. Each word that left my pen appeared simultaneously in the ledger, as if the page beneath me were connected to the one below the church by veins of ink. The words weren't mine anymore. They arranged themselves, forming sentences I didn't plan. Memory is obedience. Obedience is preservation. Preservation is love. When the sun rose, the ledger slammed shut on its own. Dust lifted from the cover like breath leaving a mouth. Outside, the townspeople were gathering again, each holding a candle. This time no bell rang to summon them. They came because they already knew. By the time dusk fell again, the whole town stood in the square. Every house was empty, every window dark. Candles formed a circle around the old bell tower, their flames bending toward the same unseen wind. I tried to stay inside my room, but the pull was gentle and absolute, like gravity disguised as invitation. My feet moved of their own accord. When I reached the square, Gideon waited at the center. He looked smaller now, framed by the tower behind him. In his hands, he carried the ledger. It was open to the last page, blank except for a single line, final testimony. He said, quietly, "Every keeper must close what they open." I didn't understand until I looked around. Each person in the crowd held a page torn from some hidden book, each page covered in different handwriting, each repeating the same 3 words: "Discipline is salvation." The phrase moved across the crowd like a tide, lips whispering in perfect unison, a rhythm that replaced breathing. The sound filled the square, filled the air, filled me. My heart synchronized with it until I could no longer tell which beat was mine. Then Gideon placed the ledger in my hands. The paper felt warm, as though it had a pulse. The empty lines shimmered faintly in the candlelight, asking not for ink but for memory. And suddenly I remembered everything. The tunnels, the faces in the mirrors, the girls' letters. Their voices pressed against my skull, soft as a prayer. I wrote, not words at first, just shapes, circles joined by lines, the same pattern from the walls below. Each mark brightened until the page glowed like embers under snow. When the pen stopped moving, the ledger closed by itself. The bell tower groaned. Its rusted frame began to move though no wind touched it. The sound that came out was deeper than metal, half earth, half voice. It rang once, twice, then a third time that didn't end but stretched into a hum that filled the whole valley. The townspeople bowed their heads. Their candles did not go out. Instead, they sank slowly into the ground, the flames folding inward until only faint circles of heat remained in the dirt. The hum subsided. Gideon stepped forward and whispered, "The record is complete." Then, one by one, the townspeople turned and walked back into the fog. No words, no farewell. They simply dissolved into the whiteness like pages returning to a book. I stood alone. The bell tower loomed above me, silent once more. In the faint light, I saw new carvings at its base, hundreds of names, including my own, etched so freshly that dust still clung to the edges. Below mine, someone had already begun the next line, waiting for another name. I left Beaumont's Rest at sunrise. This time the road opened easily, as though the town itself had exhaled. Behind me, the fog thinned and the landscape settled back into ordinary silence. At the first gas station miles away, I stopped to breathe. The attendant glanced at the ledger tucked beneath my arm and asked, "Old church records?" I smiled and said yes, but when I turned the cover to show him, the pages were blank. He laughed politely and handed me my change. "Funny thing," he said, "every year around this time, we get someone through here carrying a book like that. Always looks new, always heading east." I asked if they ever came back. He shook his head. "Not that I recall." I drove until the town was just a memory behind the trees. Yet even now, sometimes, when the world is quiet enough, I hear the faint ring of that bell. 3 notes repeating, slower each time, as though the sound itself were running out of breath. And somewhere inside that fading rhythm, a voice asks the same question it asked a century ago. "Are you ready for attendance?" I never answer. I only listen and keep the record.